Good evening, everybody. It's good to have all the students in the room tonight for the purpose of the class is our closing session for what's going to be later appearing on YouTube. Just one more of our LSLP session webinars that we like to where we like to have colleagues and scholars come in and share their insights about what it means to do research. So this is going to be more than a lecture because I'm not necessarily very keen on that style. It's more like a conversation where we get to have our distinguished guest in Dr. Jayne Lammers sharing part of her journey as a researcher, and then we'll have a conversation about the act of doing research and what it means for us as teachers and scholars and everything in between. What's important, and this to clarify, I think that for novice researchers, sometimes it makes more of an impact to have a colleague come and talk about the journey and what it means to do research than come and give a formal lecture. I mean, there's a lot of reading they do. There's a lot of content we already have in the course. So I like the personal part. I mean, we always talk about how one of the characteristics of qualitative research is that it's personalistic, that the person is part of it, that this person is an important part, that we write in the first person. But so it's important to bring that personal and that personalistic dimension to the conversations that we hold about qualitative research. So with that introduction, let me then formally welcome to this space a great, someone who started as a colleague and became a friend over the course of several years in a number of conferences where we overlapped, collided, and everything in between, in Dr. Jayne Lammers. Dr. Lammers she's a professor at the University of Rochester. Recently, she was a Fulbright scholar in Indonesia, and she's been a fierce advocate of this push for a more global, not even international, but global and transnational perspective in the field of literacy studies. And I think that part of the global is the one thing that has brought us closer as colleagues and friends in the conversation. So I'm honored to have you here tonight. This will be the last thing I'll say for a while, because I think what the students want to hear is about you. They've already heard enough about me for 2 semesters already. I can just shut down my microphone for a little bit and give you the floor. So without any further ado, Jayne, the floor is yours, and we're very happy to have you here tonight.
Thank you very much. What a lovely introduction. I appreciate it. I am glad to be a part of your worldwide academic family. And it's wonderful to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for inviting me into your classroom space. So I am a teacher at heart, and I was a secondary English teacher in middle school and high schools down in Central Florida. And I wanted to understand how to get young people more engaged in the classroom learning that was happening. So the reading and writing that we were asking them to do. And I also wanted to help my colleagues from other content areas deal with the request that was being made in US schools at the time for every teacher to be a reading teacher. And I remember in particular my math teacher colleague in one middle school was really frustrated. She's like, I've been teaching math for 30 years. I don't know how to be a reading teacher. That's not what I signed up for. I don't want to do this. So that's what led me to go to Arizona State University to get a Ph.D. and I wanted to study content area literacy. But as happens often in graduate school, you have plans for what you want to do, but then you start learning, or another professor, or in my case, 2 professors, show up one summer, and your whole career changes. And for me, that change happened when Dr. Jim G. and Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, then now Betty G., showed up at Arizona State University, and I got to be a graduate assistant on one of Betty's projects, where she was using the video game The Sims to serve as a vehicle to get young women interested in computers and potentially on a trajectory for computer science careers. And so I worked with them and took classes from Jim G, where he talked about video games as well-designed learning systems, where he talked about the literacy practices involved in playing a video game. And at first, I was a big skeptic, a huge skeptic. You should see the notes that I wrote in Jim's books when I was a student. I did not believe it. I felt like video games were what kept my students from reading. But eventually I spent more time in his classes and on her project and realized that there were all kinds of online communities that were happening where young people would go to find out more information, to improve their gameplay, to share tips with each other, to do walkthroughs, where they would learn how to create content for their games. And in particular, we wanted to ask the young women to write stories with the video game The Sims. And as an English teacher, I find that it's really important to look at a mentor text or a model when I need to write something new that I'm not familiar with. So I did a Google search for The Sims and stories. And that's how I found this online community of more than 12,000 people, most of them young women from all around the world, who were writing stories and sharing them with each other and giving each other feedback. And they were doing peer review and the kinds of writer's workshop things that I wanted to try to teach in my class. But they were doing it just because they liked the game, or just because they liked stories, or for whatever reason. That became my dissertation project. And I did a 2-year virtual ethnography. I did a discourse-centered online ethnography where I was studying the discourse of this online space. I used G's theory of affinity spaces to understand what was happening there and how people could participate in a variety of ways. I wrote 3 different analyses initially about what I was seeing there. One of them started by looking at one thread where the participants in the community were debating what they wanted the community to be. And I used that to uncover different tensions that happen in an online space, and how G, for example, talks about the core factor that brings people together in an affinity space is a common endeavor. But what if the common endeavor isn't shared in common? What if it's contested? What if there are multiple reasons for coming to that space? I did another analysis of one young woman who was a newbie and how she leveraged the community and what she could get in the online forum to improve the products and the writing and the creations that she did. That one was published in Research of Teaching in English. I also did another analysis that looked at the teaching practices that were happening, how young people were teaching each other about the expectations of the space. So all of those kind of came together and set me on a trajectory of trying to understand, how do young people leverage their own kind of understandings of digital literacy? How do they leverage online spaces for their own interest-driven learning? And then I always asked, why should English teachers care? That young people are spending all this time online, so what? That community that I studied, the forum that I studied, had participants from Canada, the UK, and beyond, and the US and beyond, but still very Western cultures. And so that was the first dip into the waters of being a global academic and trying to study something that was happening around the world and the connectedness that was made possible in online spaces, but again, still very Western. Much more recently, as Raul shared, I had a Fulbright where I was able to go to Semarang, Indonesia, which is in central Java. And I was able to work with one of my former PhD students who was herself a Fulbright scholar. And we asked the question of what were the digital literacy practices of the secondary youth down there. And in particular, we wanted to know about their practices because most of the literacy theory that we read and know is based on studies of Western youth or Western ways of thinking. And we're trying to understand whether or not there are meaningful differences in how the predominantly Muslim young people in that island area are making sense of their technology use. So I was there right before this global pandemic shut everything down and got to collect data from 618 young people across 6 grades and 7 schools in that local region. And we conducted focus groups, and most meaningfully, it was me working in partnership from the very beginning with a local Indonesian scholar. And that's been part of the advocacy that Raul talks about that I've been doing, is this need to work in communication from the very beginning of design of a study with somebody who's in the local context that I want to study. And then always working with her to understand how best to communicate our findings out to global scholars. So earlier this year, we published a commentary in the Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy calling for the need for a global turn in our digital literacy research, and this need to privilege and spend more time and attention learning from young people and scholars in the global South, because we just don't have enough of that out there in the research community. So I feel like I'm just talking at you, and so with that introduction, I've, in terms of a highlight list of the kinds of research I've done, like I said, I did the virtual ethnography. I've done individual case studies. So I did a longitudinal case study of one adolescent through her entire high school career and traced her different writing practices in different contexts. I've also done a lot to put my research in conversation with other people's research, doing retrospective analyses or linguistic analyses. So I have 2 colleagues that I work with quite a bit as we study fan fiction and affinity spaces. And that is Jen Scott Kerwood from the University of Sydney in Australia and Alicia Magnifico from the University of New Hampshire here in the US. And the 3 of us often work together to understand how these online affinity spaces function as sites of literacy learning and what connections young people make beyond those. We've also started doing teacher professional development and then studies of that. So yeah, I'm going to stop talking for a little bit and just see what sorts of questions you all have, or what research you're exploring and how I might be able to offer from my background to help shape the research you're interested in.
Thank you. Thank you, Jayne. I think at this particular point, I wanted to really comment on a couple of things that you said that were very, very powerful in my view. The first one was when you talked about the idea of grad school as a game changer, no pun intended, considering you work with Jim and Betty, no pun, no, absolutely no pun, but yeah, in the sense that grad school, as you said, sometimes we have one idea and we start in one direction, and then grad school happens, or the doctoral program happens, or the master's program happens, and it takes you on a whole new journey. And I think that's important to point out because sometimes you think, and that's the part that sometimes I feel with the master students and even the doc students, that just because you proposed an idea at the very beginning of the program, that's the one idea you have to carry out till the end. And sometimes that creates a lot of, as we had the conversation before we started the session with Sonia, that every time you get a new idea, something changes, and then you don't know how to deal with that. So I wanted to start with that. As those changes, as you noticed that shift was happening, how did you manage that?
Well, I think I resisted at first, quite honestly. I kind of thought of the assistantship as just a job, and I was still going to go do my other work and still stay focused on disciplinary literacy or content area literacy, because I was also simultaneously teaching that class. So I felt like I could try to do both and resist the pull. But the more and more I learned and the more I saw of young people actually using technology and saw of the online communities, it became harder to resist the pull to want to understand kind of the intersection of digital literacy and why classroom teachers should care about what young people are doing outside of class. So I felt like I had something I could contribute by being a bridge between classroom spaces and teachers and these online spaces. And I felt like if a skeptic like me who resisted so fervently early on could come around and believe that there was value here, that maybe I would be able to communicate more to other teacher and adult skeptics.
I love that. I love that particular perspective and the skepticism that sometimes you have with the topic, and how, yeah, you take sometimes the classes just because they're a class, and then you realize that that's where the shift happens. I had another question, and now after these questions, I'm just giving the students enough time to start either typing the questions in the chat or open their microphones. But there's two particular things I wanted to pick your brain about, and they had to do with your conceptual and methodological choices. So when you talked about how you explored G's idea of affinity spaces, and then when you talked about using virtual ethnography as your methodological weapon of choice for your dissertation. So the one question is, when you started doing that, how did that start changing your views about doing research? Because again, the students here are navigating their conceptual frameworks. They're starting to think about the methodology. Most of them will do qualitative studies, but they're thinking, do I do a qualitative study that's an action research, or do I do do I pick elements of case study? And so the big question is, as you were looking at these two elements, affinity spaces and virtual ethnography, how did that start to change your own perceptions of the act of doing research?
Yeah. Wow, you're really taking me back. I remember when I was first designing the study, I did not have the language of discourse-centered online ethnography. I had been reading Christine Hines' work on online ethnography or virtual ethnography, and I knew I wanted to embed myself into that online forum and see it as a culture, to see it as a learning community, as a space. But I remember being in a conference. It was a media and language conference in Seattle. And I was listening to the keynote, and his name was Yanis Andritsopoulos. And he started talking about research that he did in Germany of rap artists. And he was the one, he started describing the steps he was taking. And I was kind of like, wait a second, that sounds a lot like what I'm trying to do. And he had written this article outlining the steps and calling it discourse-centered online ethnography. And I thought, oh my gosh, like that's what I'm trying to do. And when I read that work and saw the specific steps, it felt very comforting to now have like a roadmap to follow, right? I knew what I kind of wanted to do. There wasn't anything it was really called that I knew of. I hadn't read anything. So being at a conference keynote was like, oh, okay, this is what I'm doing. And then the other thing that I was grateful for is, so I was using G's theory of affinity spaces. Well, in G's other work, he does a lot with discourse. That he started as a linguist, and he does a lot with discourse analysis. And so to find a methodology that centered discourse so prominently as Andritsopoulos' discourse-centered online ethnography, I saw the ways in which they would work together and not step on each other. Is kind of how I describe it to students. When they try to map on a concept or a theory onto a method and they're in conflict with each other or they step on each other, that makes your research hard to set up in terms of logic. So I think being open to and doing as much as you can to participate in online webinars, conferences, reading widely, and about methodology is one way, and then attending to making sure that you select concepts, theories, methods that work together in concert to help you understand what it is you're trying to understand. It's really hard. I want to say that out loud too. It's really hard, especially as you're learning, because you can't have read all of the methodology research. You absolutely cannot. So I think listening to advisors or instructors, seeing more, like sometimes reading articles, not because you want to know all of the things about it, but just reading methodology sections. Like, how are they doing this? It's a lot to learn, but I think that's kind of how you do it.
Right, and I think that, I mean, you just, again, and yeah, if I was gonna smirk in when you said I'm making you go way back, but I think that's part of the, that's one of the things I like to do when I bring the guests. Is also to help the students notice that we all started the same. Basically, we started at the same place they are right now. And because, I mean, if we start talking about where we are at the present, I think sometimes that scares them off too much. But if we go we reflect on the journey that we took. And I wanted to point out from your answers some couple of interesting things. One is that sometimes, and this is going to happen to you, I mean, students in the class and folks who watch the webinar and are beginning to do research, sometimes you're going to find that one book or that one article or that one thing that is going to turn a lot of your work, a lot of your ideas upside down. Like, you know, as you were reflecting on your journey, I was thinking of one of the moments that really helped me figure out a lot of things when I was for my conceptual framework was when my advisor said, you should look at Ernest Morell's dissertation. And she actually said it to me, like, yeah, here, you need to read this. And I'm like, okay. I had at that time, I really hadn't heard much of Morell, but when I read Ernest's dissertation, I started looking for the rest of the articles I could find. Because it's like, oh, the way he talks about critical literacy is so clear. Like, I get it. Like, I just like, I downloaded like about 6 or 7 papers and I just kept reading and reading and reading. And that happens. And that's a beautiful moment when it happens. And then you keep reflecting and you keep exploring. And as you said, this is not an easy path. This is not an easy journey. This is hard.
That's hard.
And I appreciate the fact that we are becoming more candid about telling that. I mean, it's not that it's not impossible, that it's not insurmountable, but it's not easy. I mean, it's not something that you just can figure out over breakfast or like, no, that it's hard. It takes time and it takes reading. But again, that it's not impossible. It's not insurmountable. It's still doable. It's just, it's a hard journey.
Right. Absolutely. And I think the more and more we peel back the curtain and reveal the challenges or reveal like where inspiration comes from and what people can do. So it's about going to conferences, watching webinars, reading widely, asking questions, listening to the advice of your instructors, taking advantage of different opportunities as you have them, making more opportunities. I think especially now with social media, participating in Twitter chats or online webinars. And then, you know, academics like to talk about their work. They like to share. So I tell students all the time, if there is an author that you've read about and you've got questions or you want to offer some praise or you want to ask, you know, how did this work behind the scenes? What is it that I'm not seeing in the article? Or do you have suggestions? Academics love talking about what they do. So send them an email, send them a tweet, send them a message. It's, don't be shy, right? And we are globally connected, so you have more access to people who are doing work than I think ever before. And you don't have to go sit in a library and try to read books in order to do it, right?
Absolutely. And I think that part of, yeah, reach out to the academics. And I wanted to piggyback on what you said about asking them about what's behind it, what the behind the scenes. I think that's one of my, I think personally, when I get emails from students asking questions, I mean, like, and they ask about the process of writing, the process of putting it together, that, I mean, there is behind every article we write, behind every book chapter, behind every book, there is a story.
Oh, yeah.
And we're happy to share the story if you ask us about it, because as we tell the story, we can help you realize that this journey is not as impossible as you thought it was. And that one of the characteristics of this academic work is that it can be sometimes really random and sometimes it can be really messy, but at the end of the day, the pieces start coming into place. But I think it's important, as you said, we keep peeling back the curtain, we keep going really breaking the fourth wall. I always argue that the problem with articles is that they're really pretty. Articles are really pretty. and they're very pretty. I mean, I see the publications, I see the article, and I'm like, oh my God, this looks so cute. And then I start thinking how we got there. And I'm kind of thinking now that I have Effie here, we just recently, today we submitted a book chapter. And the story behind that chapter has been all over the place, but we finally did it. And once it comes out, it's going to look really pretty. But understanding what goes behind the scenes, that's important to navigate the confusion, to navigate all these moments where you don't know where you're going. But I'm going to stop talking right now because I really want you, the 7 of you who made it to the webinar, representing your classmates, your compadres, but also representing other grad students everywhere who may have questions at this particular point. And I'm going to open the floor for your questions. I would kindly ask you when you ask the question, just because since we're recording this, if you can, for that moment you ask the question, turn on, if you're going to use the microphone, just turn on your webcam so we can see you. So is there anybody who wants to start the conversation or raise a question or make a comment? Sonia, go for it.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Sonia Gonzalez. I am from Boyacá, a department in Colombia, but I live in Bogotá. I have been teacher for almost 9 years, and I work with little children. I work with first and second graders, and most of the time this has been my experience. When I start in the past, I was teacher from different levels, but most of the time I have been with them, with little children, and they gave me the possibility to start creating some different ideas about what I want to do. When I arrived today, I wrote a question that I want to ask you, but maybe when you start introducing yourself and sharing your big experience that is so rich and that is so admirable, I think that everything is possible because you encourage us, because you mention and you expose your experience with happiness, with so talent that I say, oh my goodness, everything is possible. So you are like a model. I'm sorry, here I have my cat. Most of the time he used to do that. I'm sorry. I was thinking when I was listening to you that I think at the beginning, what could be the best advice to do research? But as I said before, when I listen to you, I think you are inviting us to go beyond what we expect, because at this level, maybe we are a little bit scared and we don't know exactly what to do or how to do the things. And even when I had some questions, when I was reading some articles or to create and to start creating my conceptual framework, I thought at the beginning, oh my goodness, somebody in the world had the same idea that I have, or maybe it was something similar, but this person managed the idea in a different way. How can I change it? Because I don't want to do the same thing that he or she did. I want to do something different, but with some references. So more than a question, I want to say thank you, because in these short minutes, I learned that I need to encourage myself, that I need to be brave, because maybe because we don't have a lot of experience, we say, can I do a really good research? In this moment, as you mentioned, there are a lot of things about methodologies and topics, and so many academic terms that we say, oh my goodness, what's the correct option to do that? But I think that the answer is going to be in front of us when we have the experience. As you said, the most important is to be in a continuous reading and searching, because we need to be updated with the information. That is a big accomplishment that we have as students, as teachers, as professionals. So I don't know. I'm so happy, and maybe I have a lot of questions about my project. I want to work with something about CLIL, and that is going to be my proposal. How can I manage CLIL? But CLIL is a big topic, and I need to find my specific and a small point in the whole world. But I think that maybe if I change my mind, if I change the way that I do the things, I need to write, because I have had some questions, but I didn't write to the people that did those projects. And that is a very good opportunity to improve our level and to improve our research that we are starting in this moment. This is a long journey, as you said. And I really like to know that you are so young, you have a big experience, you have traveled, you don't stop. Because you mentioned, I started with a short idea, and in this moment you had a big project that you are sharing with us. So, as I said, it's not a good question, it is just a comment, and I want to say thank you.
Well, thank you, Sonia, for speaking up and sharing everything that you did. I do want to make a few comments based on some things that you said. As you were sharing kind of some uncertainty about how to find a topic, how to get started. I always encourage people to start with an actual real curiosity that you have. Like, what is it that you really want to know? Either based on something you're seeing in your classroom or based on something that you're reading, a phenomenon that you run into out in your travels in some ways, whether it be part of coursework, assistantship, work, your own learning, your family, whatever it may be. So starting with a genuine curiosity that you have, I think, is helpful. The next thing I think that helps is, you mentioned reading, right? So reading widely. And the more we read, the more I think we understand what is already known and can find our niche and our potential entry point into the conversation. And typically in education research, we don't do a lot of replication, right? Like trying things over and over again. But some people actually make that a criticism of education research, that we don't replicate. So I wouldn't necessarily reject if you see somebody, you said they've already done what I want to do. They've done this before. But if it hasn't exactly been done in your context, with your learners, your students, you might have something else to contribute in something that is somewhat like a replication. And thanks for saying that I'm young and I'm still doing this. I appreciate the connections that I've had over the years and around the world, and how those kind of fuel me. I shared with you all a link to an article, in part because I was thinking about what Raul was saying about the story behind every article. And the story behind this article, this was the first one that Jen and Alicia and I published. And it began because we presented together at a conference, and we had a discussant who said to us in our presentation, we each did our own individual research, and she said, "Why aren't you three writing together?" And so we went up into the hotel room that the other two were sharing, and Jen had seen this call for proposals. And we sat down on the hotel room floor and we wrote out a 500-word abstract. It was due the next day. And we submitted it to English Teaching Practice and Critique. And suddenly they said, yes, you're welcome to contribute. We thought, oh, crap, now we have to write something, right? And so we sat down together and we started writing. And the rest of the story of this one, so that was in early December. This article was published in July of the following year. That's how fast it happened. But along the way, I took a draft of the paper to my faculty writing group. And one of my colleagues, Ed Brockenbrough, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania, he said to me, you know, I think this is great, but I actually think you have 3 papers here. You have this, you have this, and you have that. And we took the methodology one, which was the focus of the special issue we were contributing, and we fleshed that out into a full paper. And we looked at each other and said, okay, well, there are 3 of us, and if we have 3 papers, maybe we'll each take a turn leading it. And we ended up publishing, I think now more than 10 papers together, and we just keep like cycling through. But this was the first one, and it got published because of a discussion at a conference, an opportunity, and then a faculty writing group. So lots of different supports along the way.
Thank you so much.
And I think Maria raised her hand to ask a question next.
Yeah, if we go for it.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
Hello, nice to meet you. Thank you very much. Well, I just wanted to say that the research I am doing right now is concerned with fandom and those community spaces you were talking about. So I kind of know the concept that you mentioned of affinity spaces, and all of this comes from my experience as a fan. I am a fan of many things. I love watching TV shows, and I'm a fan of many bands like 21 Pilots, like Youngblood, like Taylor Swift, and many others. So coming from this experience, I just know it, like I have it on good authority that we can learn languages just from that contact that we have in these online communities. So I share with you that passion that you showed us. But I just wanted to say too that recently I started working with first and second graders at a school. Well, I've been wondering how I can like attach those things together, like with work and what I want to do with research, because it's kind of hard when you think about it, like with kids, so that they are so young. Yes, they are so young. So it's like, what kind of activities? Here comes the question: what kind of activities maybe you would do with kids at such a young age that would be related to those concepts of affinity spaces and communities and online fandoms, because since they still haven't got these skills like very mature of writing and reading, I don't really know how to approach that with them. And so I would like to know maybe if you have some ideas or some recommendations, and thank you very much.
I love that question, Maria. Thank you so much for asking it. And I'm so excited that you are a fan and you are pursuing your own passion and bringing it into your research. So 2 summers ago, Alicia and I had the opportunity to teach a literacy course, a Literacy Institute course. It was a teacher professional development course at her university. We did a week-long 3-credit graduate course with 10 teachers where we introduced them to fan fiction research and fan fiction communities. And I remember the first day when we were in that class and we were sitting around this big table and we asked the teachers to introduce themselves and who were they, what grades they were teaching, and why did they take this class. And the first 2 people who introduced themselves one was a kindergarten teacher and the other one taught first grade. And they both said that the only reason that they took the class was because it fit in their schedule and they needed the graduate credit. That they were not fans of anything and they had no idea what we were talking about. And they had no idea how it was going to impact their classroom. And I remember when we took a break, I turned to Alicia and said, what the heck are we going to do with them, right? Like, how are we going to help them? Everything we've done has been with, young adults or maybe high schoolers, right? Like this woman, one woman, we now call her Penelope in our study. So 4 of those teachers, one of whom was the kindergarten teacher, agreed to be in a research study with us, where we followed them in the year after their participation in that course, that summer class. And we interviewed them twice and surveyed them to see how they were using what they learned about fandoms in their classroom instruction. And we haven't had a chance yet to write about or with Penelope, but we've been doing a lot of analysis of kind of the playful literacy practices that she brought into her kindergarten classroom. And so here's what she did, Maria. Kindergartners do a lot of author studies or like book studies, right? Like genre studies. And she did an author a month. And she talked to students about, they would read all the different work of that author and almost make it like a fandom kind of case study of that author. And she would ask them to draw pictures or things that were similar to those picture books, or to replicate of the author studies, because that's what fan fiction and fandom is really all about. It's that replication and that honoring of the original canon, or in her case, like the author studies. And I don't remember, I'm not as familiar with children's books as maybe some of you are, but I remember there was one author that would put little, like a little mark on the bottom page of her book to indicate that you needed to go to the next page. And Penelope started seeing her students on their stories that they would write. They would start copying that kind of pattern after they studied that author. They also did, in December, they did a gingerbread man story author study and kind of did a deep dive into the fandom of the gingerbread stories and how that got translated in different cultures. So I think by studying either a type of text or an author, you're starting to introduce young readers and writers into similarities of developing what you like, passions, fandoms of certain things. And, I remember when Penelope was looking at online spaces and she thought, that's not anything, like I can't write fan fiction, but they create fan art, right? About the kinds of stories or things that they were watching or interested in or reading. So I think there actually is a lot of opportunity. And soon, I hope, sometime in the next year, the pandemic did interrupt us, but I hope that Alicia and I will be writing with Penelope about the experience of bringing fandom practices into her kindergarten classroom, because it is possible, but we don't hear a lot about it. You might look into the work of Karen Wolwin, who does a lot with play and literacy, especially with young learners. She's been somebody that we have paid attention to as we try to understand Penelope's data.
Okay,
and
thank
yes,
you. That's amazing. Yes, I'm going to
it
take
can
that
be
down.
done.
And now that you should mention it, like I remember that That's last week we introduced the topic about toys, and we were talking about teddy bears, and so like, students were really excited. And I asked them like, "Hey kids, have you watched Paddington?" And many of them were like, "Yes, but the TV show of the Nickelodeon TV show, but I watch it in Spanish." So when we watched the trailer for the movie for Paddington, they were really excited. So I think maybe I should write something about that, because that is fandom indeed.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's early fandom, right?
Yes, definitely. Thank you very much, Doctor.
You're welcome, Maria. And I gave you a link to Karen Woolman's website in case you're interested in following up more about her research and what she does with young children.
Marvelous. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you. I mean, I love the conversation. I love the, and I think this is an important, I mean, as these conversations are happening, this is a very important, learning moment for everybody watching the webinar. Because that is the nature of how we do research. I mean, research is not something that, and Jayne can attest to this, that this is not something that we just woke up one morning and I have a topic, and I'm just going to develop a project, and I'm just going to write a proposal, and I'm going to write a grant. Like, no, it doesn't work like that.
No.
Sometimes it works that, again, sometimes providence, I mean, serendipity has it that, as you said, I love the story. I mean, I love the story how you, Alicia, and Jen met, and there's like, and the amazing collaboration that, I mean, that in the prolific collaboration that the three of you have, it's admirable. And because it's very serendipitous, but that's how it happens sometimes. But I think one of the important lessons here, as you were talking, for example, and you were exchanging ideas with Effie about her work with fandom and how to tie it to the class, and that is how research happens. Research basically happens in many cases is you just wake up and you start talking about it, and you start talking to people, and you start running ideas by friends, and you have coffee. And sometimes we go to conferences when we can't travel, and you have coffee, or big shout out. I'm gonna take a quick shout out to Alicia that about the chocolate, or she said have chocolate, and in having chocolate or trading chocolate, you more ideas flow. And I think that's an important lesson from this webinar, as research is something you do, but part of doing research is talking about it. It's finding people you can talk to, and I mean, colleagues, close friends, mentors that you have along the way, and really talk. I mean, because as you verbalize, that's the interesting thing. Like, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's how, in your case, Jayne, but my case is, the more I talk about it, it's like the more I see branches come in, and I can see I can go this way, and then I can take this and do it later. But I think the important, and that's why I love the exchange, and I love that it's going to be recorded on the webinar, because that exchange is the very nature of the act of doing research. It's the fact that you talk, and the fact that you have conversations, and in the conversations you throw ideas to each other, and then if you're a more experienced researcher, what you do is you suggest. And I love the suggestions through the work with Karen Woolman, because and I see that I can see the overlaps with the ideas that Effie is trying to develop with fandom in her elementary school class. I can see the connections right there. So I love the fact that, again, that research is something that we do by talking, and there's a lot of talking in the process of, and sometimes students don't realize how much talking there is about doing research. That usually, I mean, sometimes the last thing we do is write, and that sometimes we write after hours and hours and hours of talking, and sometimes talking that doesn't seem to go anywhere. Sometimes you have the meetings with your research group, with your research team, and it's like, this conversation doesn't seem to be going anywhere. No, it's going somewhere. It's never static, but I love that. I love that interaction.
Yeah, and it's not just talking. It could also be running or doing dishes. Those quiet moments, right? Where you're still working it in your mind. And everything that you've read, the talking that you've done, the looking at data, all of a sudden you can have something click for you.
Absolutely. And the beautiful thing is when it clicks, I don't know, it's like the world looks shinier, the day seems brighter. You start seeing rainbows where there aren't. I don't know. You run into puppies where you least expect. I mean, no, but it's beautiful because sometimes it happens like that. In serendipity, and this is the part that when we unveil the secrets, like sometimes students don't realize how much serendipity plays a role in designing research. The serendipity of having a conversation or watching a webinar or sometimes stumbling upon an article while you're downloading articles for your lit review.
Yeah, you have to make yourself available, right? So, and you shouldn't think of place or geography as constraining availability now. So I think one thing that I do to stay, I mean, there's a ton of literature that gets published. It's really hard to stay on top of it. But Google helps us, right? You can set up a Google alert for a particular scholar or a particular label. So I have had a Google alert for affinity space for the last decade. And so every time something gets published and it ends up on Google Scholar, I get an email. So it's one way I stay up on it. I've found certain journals that publish the kind of research that I'm most interested in. And I set up the email alerts. So anytime there's a new table of contents, a new issue, I get an email alert and I get to see what's being published and I can see the abstracts. Mm-hmm. So I send emails all the time to students because I'm like, oh, this makes me think of your project or this makes me think of your project. And they think I'm like this fantastic advisor who must read super widely. No, I use my digital literacies, right? I let the technology do the work for me and bring things into my kind of stream of information. I follow people on Twitter and I make sure I check it a couple of times a week and I see what are the scholars doing? What's going on in the literacies hashtag? So I think creating your own kind of personal learning network is how I teach it to my grad students. Is really important. What's the stream of information that's coming at you in terms of your research and your topic, and what are you doing with it?
Yeah, I think I'm just gonna follow up on. Yeah, first of all, Google Scholar, it's a very useful tool if you maximize it. So it's not simply, I mean, a lot of people sometimes think that Google Scholar is just to look at how many citations you have, and that's part of it, but it's not the entire thing. Yeah. But the alerts are actually they can be very helpful in coming in. Sometimes I do. I mean, I get some very interesting suggestions that I also like to pass around. But one thing that Jayne said that I want to pick, I mean, I really think it's a very useful piece of advice for the students, is make sure people you work with, especially the grad level, your advisors, professors you trust, mentors you have, they really know what you're up to, because especially when we have several of them, if we know what they're up to and we stumble upon the articles that we do, it's a lot easier to relay them to you. If you tell people, if people know what you're doing, it's a lot easier for us to send you suggestions, because we, again, professors, we get a lot of alerts and we get a lot of updates about articles that are coming out. Sometimes we get it through ResearchGate, sometimes we get it through academia, sometimes we get it on Google Scholar, sometimes it's just Twitter, sometimes it's Facebook, because everybody tells you they just published an article and you're like, oh, that could be helpful for one of you. But if you don't tell people where your mind is going in terms of the work, it's really difficult for people to send you suggestions.
I agree. So don't be shy about what you're interested in studying, and share that interest in your class. Tell people. I also think it's a responsibility that you and I have, Raul, as kind of advisors, as mentors, to folks we're trying to apprentice into the academic practice is we've got to make space for people to have those conversations, because they don't happen naturally for everybody, right? They happen for some people. So I have, tomorrow night is what I call my Lammers academic family meeting. So all of my doc students are coming together so that I can hear what's everybody working on, what's everybody doing, and they can hear each other. I meet with colleagues at the coffee shop. You know, you and I love a good coffee shop. So Friday mornings at the coffee shop, and we start by what is everybody working on, so that I know, they know what I'm doing, I know what they're doing, so we can make those connections.
I mean, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, in the power of the coffee shop is it's underrated. Sometimes it's, I mean, well, here, I'm just gonna say here in Colombia, it's underrated. People, students really haven't realized the magic of coffee shops. I mean, those of us who are got education in the U.S., especially in the big state universities, we know the magic, and we know how many dissertations get written in coffee shops. I mean, if you ask a lot of Ph.D.s, what did you write your dissertation? They're not going to tell you in my office or at home. A lot are going to tell you, oh, there was this coffee shop. There was this coffee shop where I sat down and I wrote it. I know the one I wrote my dissertation at, and I can think of 3 or 4 friends of mine who actually wrote the dissertation at the same coffee shop. So that's a recommendation for you folks. Look, if you can find somewhere near you a place where you can have coffee, has Wi-Fi, and you can plug in your laptop, go have some coffee, and you'll see that the coffee shops have certain magic and allure. This is the time where we still have a few students here who haven't had a chance to say anything. So I'm gonna, if you want to make a comment, raise a question, engage in the conversation, just raise your hand, turn your camera on, and go for it. So anyone? Folks? All right, so, oh, John, go for it.
Sorry, I was just trying to open the microphone. It took me a long time, so I'm so sorry. And good evening. First of all, I really want to thank you for this space for talking, because I agree with you both when you say that talking is the best way to get to know other experiences. And actually, that's what I'm interested about in my own project, because, well, I think because of the pandemic and even before, with my co-workers, teachers, wonderful with, but I haven't had the chance of talking more to them and getting to learn from them. And that's what I'm interested about in my own project, trying to make a space for us to interact and learn from each other. And that's a funny thing, because when I graduated from, well, my undergraduate program in 2017, and I had been thinking about like 5 ideas for different projects. But I started this master's and I forgot everything, because I used to be very individualistic. Like, I have this idea, I think this works for teaching my my contents, but I noticed that thanks to interaction, not only with people, but interacting with the materials, documents, the context, and many things, we can learn a lot. And that's, well, like the idea for my question for you, Dr. Lammers, about you have mentioned that you have worked a lot with other 2 people in your projects. I'd like to know how different they are from you, from your ideas, and how those differences have come into, well, like a balance for doing those 10 projects you mentioned. How has that experience been for you? I mean, working with other people, learning from them, and even making these projects with them.
Such a great question. So I think in particular, this trio that has worked together for quite some time, we had enough overlap in our topic interest. We were all English teachers, and we are all now English teacher educators. We run the English, like secondary English programs at our 3 universities. So we have similarities enough in our background and in our like field and what our jobs have us thinking about. But we are very different in what our strengths are in terms of research and publication, especially. And what we learned over time is how to play to those strengths. So, for example, especially early on, Jen, Dr. Kerwood was very like, we need to do this, that. She was very methodical. She had surveyed the landscape of what it took to be published. She was receiving invitations and paying attention to calls for submissions much earlier than I was ever even aware of those things, right? So she was a driving force in like, okay, what are we going to do next? And how are we going to work virtually from across the globe? Like, what are we going to do? She would set up our Google Docs and outline, you know, how many words should be in what section and who was going to do it. And Dr. Magnifico, Alicia, is very kind of a deep theoretical thinker, asks a lot of questions, reads widely, but also like reads very conceptual work. Like she's a great kind of theoretical person. And I think part of me wants to be humble and be like, and I don't know what I brought to the group, but I don't want to do that because I want to not fall into that feminine trope of discounting my own contributions. And want to say, like, I think for me it was like the systematic analysis was something that I was well trained for. And one of my advisor trained me really well to look for kind of the logic of a piece or like consistency throughout a piece. And I also was a yearbook editor back in high school. So like looking at formatting stuff and making sure that everything fits well was something that I brought. And we learned to play to each of those strengths, right? And we also made agreements and had conversations early on about what it would mean to co-author, and we never missed a deadline. We never didn't contribute when it was our turn to contribute. So we had great respect for each other and our own integrity, and we didn't slack off. And, you know, I worked harder when I needed to show up with those colleagues or for those colleagues. It's easier to let life get in the way when it's just yourself. But when you have to show up for others, it kind of holds you accountable. So yeah, and now we are all doing our own individual different research. Jen has spent a lot of time doing grant-funded research to understand spoken word poetry down in Sydney and kind of those communities. She's even done some spoken word poetry herself and performed because she wanted to develop that authenticity. You can find her on YouTube. It's a story about raising her oldest son. And Alicia has done a lot of work with teachers and kind of bridging the gap between high school and college and first year writing and working with educators in both contexts in this Dialogues project. And she's done a lot of work with teachers in New Hampshire. And then I took my global turn and went down to Indonesia and tried to understand more of that kind of aspect. And we still see each other. We take pictures at the conferences in front of the Christmas trees that LRA always has and each year. And we're still very much connected, even though we don't write very much as a trio together. We did talk at a webinar together earlier this year. Those kinds of friendships and collaborations are really meaningful, I think, for me.
Okay, and do you think that teamwork, that such nice teamwork you have had with them, has affected your, for example, now your project, the one you are working individually, like taking that those characteristics of your coworkers?
Absolutely. So I've done a lot of collaborative writing with doctoral students of mine since working with Jen and Alicia. And I'm very transparent with them about what the expectations are of being a first author, versus second. And a lot of the practices that I learned from working with Jen and Alicia are now practices that I bring to my collaborations with other students. And, you know, Pooja Studi went from the two of us publishing on her dissertation research with me being kind of a supportive second author to now us co-publishing and co-designing the study that we did in Indonesia. And a lot of that is based off of how I learned to collaborate with Jen and Alicia.
Okay, that's very nice. Thank you very much.
That was a very nice question, John. And I think co-authoring, as Jayne was talking about, it's I mean, once if you can do it and you can find people to work with, it can be very enriching. But I think you always have to have the ground rules. And as you were thinking about, I was thinking about the handbook and how in the process of the handbook, the five of us were not necessarily all engaged at the same time. But we set, as you said, we set the ground rules in saying there's going to be moments when one of us is going to have something's going to happen, and life happened. I mean, there were moments when someone had to make a move, or someone was in the middle of what I think one of them was going for tenure, and we kind of said, okay, so we agreed that if one of us cannot do something at one time, we can all come and jump in and help, with the promise that when it was time to return the favor, we would do exactly that. So once, I think it's important, as Jayne pointed out, when you're working and collaborating co-authoring teams, especially when it's peers, because I mean, usually the dynamics when you're working with your students are a little different, and it's easier for you to come and sit and lay the smack down, so to speak, because you're the professor. So it's easier to say, I'll lay the rules and these are the rules. When you're working with peers, you really have to agree on what those rules are going to be, and make sure we all have the understanding that if one of us does not follow those rules, the entire enterprise is going to fail. And that usually leads to a very successful writing experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, life does happen, and there are times when some members of the collaboration can pick up the slack or may be less able to be involved. But as we've built trust over time, there's ways to deal with that, I think. But laying the ground rules and being open about expectations and having conversations, I think, is key.
All right, so with that in mind, here is my last question to you, Jayne. So it's a question I like to ask, and it's, you already noticed the crowd. The crowd are very young teachers, venturing for the first, many of them venturing for the first time ever into this endeavor we call research. And from your experience of also mentoring students of your own, what final piece of advice would you give these young master students as they're once this webinar is over and the course is over, they're going to go back to their proposals to start trying to figure out, as Sonia was pointing out, that her place in the world as a young researcher. What advice would you dispense to these to the younglings in the class, and of course the novice researchers who may listen to this webinar once it's on YouTube?
I think my greatest key to my own success is what I try to pass along to others, and that is to find a group of supportive folks in your program and share your work and your struggles with each other often. Support each other. So I was a part of a group of women. We now call ourselves the Grad School Sisterhood, and we have stayed connected across the country since Arizona State University and our time there. But we were the coffee shop writing crowd, and five of the six of us all graduated in the same year and defended our dissertations in the same 2-week period. And we wrote together, we shared drafts with each other, and I remember final versions of our dissertations were due for format review on April 1st one year, and people came over to my house on the 31st, and we just started in the morning, and we stayed until people hit submit. And the last two of us, it was me and one other woman, and she was still working. It was like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. And I was like, keep going. I had already hit submit, but I wasn't going to let her be there by herself. And it was, you know, wait until everybody's done. We had a phrase that we said, leave no dissertator behind. Another woman, she was struggling with finishing up and she wanted to give up. And I was like, no way, I'm not letting you give up. And I showed up at her doorstep and I said, print out your reference list. I'll check the references, right? And I'll make sure that's right while you work on this. And we've stayed together. A few of us are in academia. One is a writing coach. One is a principal of a school. Like, we're still doing it and still supporting each other a decade later. And I think if you can find people, don't be afraid to share early versions of your work for feedback and for support. And it is not a waste of your time to read other people's drafts. You learn from that as well. So to set up a reciprocal sharing of drafts is really supportive. And I highly, highly recommend that for people who are starting off with research. It totally takes a village, and I'm a product of it. I didn't do this by myself.
Absolutely, it totally takes a village. I mean, you know, just because an anecdote, you kind of reminded me of something really beautiful that happened when I was at the time of my dissertation. Around the time of dissertation, there were a group of us. We don't have a writing group, but there were quite a few Latinos at the College of Ed, where around between February and April, there were about 5 or 6 of us defending at different times. And the interesting thing is kind of like the work, I mean, you knew who was defending because everybody was like, yeah, this, and several people who attended, but you could see that everybody, when it was the time to defend, they would get messages and they would get a lot of support. When it was my day, a couple of the Latinos showed up to the defense, and the next day, the first day as a newly minted Ph.D, so to speak, I went to a friend of mine who was defending that very next day, and I went to his room to give him the good vibes. Now that I had survived, I could dispense the scholarly advice of the survivors. But I think those are beautiful experiences that are worth replicating. That it's important to create community. Sometimes the community is not, sometimes it's not right next door, but it can be somewhere. And create those communities. Create that, as we said, the worldwide academic fam. You have to create it and nurture it. And if you have colleagues who you appreciate, let them know. I mean, sometimes it's like, no, don't bottle up the feelings. If you have colleagues you appreciate, let them know, because sometimes they need to hear it. I think sometimes there are times when a message popping out of nowhere, I appreciate you, can mean the world when you least expect it and you need it most. So go ahead, Jayne, you were gonna say something.
No, I was just agreeing, right? Absolutely, absolutely.
So with this, we are coming now to the end of this beautiful experience, a beautiful webinar that I think it's a very nice way to wrap up for the grad students, the 2-semester experience of the research cycle in our master's program. I really want to thank you again, Jayne. I knew that this would happen, because I mean, again, as we have exchanged a lot of ideas over the past few years, I've gotten to appreciate your sensitivity as a scholar, as a researcher, as a teacher, as a mentor. And that sensitivity is something that we need these days, and we need, especially with the pandemic, we need it more and more and more. So I really want to thank you for spending this hour and fraction with us, sharing your experience, engaging in the conversation with the students who wrote the questions. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a nice way to really wrap up this semester. So once again, my gratitude.
My pleasure. I appreciated talking with you anytime, Raul. Sonia, Maria, John, others, thank you very much for the questions, for bearing witness to the conversation, for taking whatever lessons you gleaned from this and applying them in your own work. That's the joy for me of academic work, is spreading it on. So I appreciate all the reactions, all the love. Follow me on Twitter, read the work, ask questions, and I look forward to seeing some of your work out there in the future. So thank you all.
Absolutely. So once again, thanks, and for, again, as this is going to be later on YouTube, remind you this is part of the ongoing LSLP session webinars, and we invite you to check out all the other ones that we have before this one, including great conversations we have. A quick plug into we previously had Dr. Magnifico, part of that trifecta that Dr. Lammers was talking about. She also shared her ideas with us. So check it out. And once again, everybody, thank you so much, and have a very, very good night.
Bye.